Tom Baker's middle season in his 7-year-long run as the Doctor proved to be a bit of a mixed bag, so today I'm going to rank all 6 of its stories from worst to best. Naturally, this list is entirely my subjective opinion, and I can't give comprehensive reviews within this format, so if you're curious about more specific thoughts, I do already have reviews for all of these serials, so having established that, let's get started in ranking Doctor Who Season 15. It will come as no surprise to anybody watching this video that Underworld was always going to take the bottom spot on this list, a story that has been considered by many to be among Classic Who's worst outings, and having seen it, this is far and away my least favorite story from Tom Baker's era thus far. However, I don't consider it to be a complete and total abomination. It does start out entertaining enough before ultimately devolving into a meaningless compilation of people running in front of blue screens. And beyond the visual effects used in this story, I would like to point out that the actual narrative is what really fails this one. I remember having difficulty in my review when I tried to describe what was actually going on, and that's because the story really failed to ever grab me, so those details just don't stick. If you asked me now, at gunpoint, to describe what the plot of this story is, I truly don't think I'd be capable of it. But even if the plot is mediocre and the effects pull you out of the story, surely at least our lead characters can help to keep this thing captivating and memorable, right? Well, unfortunately, that was not the case. The usual fun that I expect to have with the Doctor and Leela is also absent here, and bizarrely, they just leave next to no mark within this story. Effectively, everything that you would expect to actually make a story entertaining and stick with you could not be further from what is shown within Underworld. The more I say about this one, the more convinced I am that I was maybe too kind in my review, but again, I don't hate this story, it's just dull and utterly forgettable, but at least it's only about 80 minutes long. The Invasion of Time may not be the worst story this season has to offer, but it is the one that offended me the most as an audience member. If you've seen my review, then you'll know that's because of how they chose to write off Leela from the show, something I just could not get on board with. But let's set that aside as it's only the conclusion of the serial and take a moment to look at the bigger picture. This is a prime example of a 6-parter that just drags things out far more than it needs to, and does so without really utilizing that time to further the story or develop its characters. The entire supporting cast is quite forgettable despite having 2.5 hours to play around with. None of them really make much of a mark. When you compare this to any of the 3 previous 6-parters that Tom Baker has had, it really does pale in comparison, whether it be Davros, Snyder, Harrison Chase, or somebody from Talons. I know characters' names, and I get their driving purpose, or at least remember their presence on screen. With Invasion of Time, I could tell you that Sontarans show up at some point, but could not name a single one or anything that they did other than the one who tripped over the chair by the swimming pool. It really does say a lot about a story for me when it fails to leave much of an impression in my mind, and that the impression it does leave is the sour taste of the ending in my mouth, because I remember so much more about almost every other story in this season. Maybe if this one had been just 4 parts long, it would have been stronger, only because it wouldn't have dragged as much, but I doubt that focus would have resulted in too much of an improvement considering there was so much time within this serial to deliver on the supporting characters and villains, and yet it still failed in so many ways. It's not even that bad of a serial, it's entertaining enough for me to watch the whole way through, but the more I think about it, the less I like it. The Invisible Enemy is such a drastic tonal shift from what came before it, and not really for the better. It occupies a very specific kind of space in my mind because it is the type of ridiculous story that I had fun with for what it was on initial watch, but have since soured on in the time that has elapsed since. This is where you really start to get an idea for what you're going to be in for with the Graham Williams era, and possibly get a little scared with the direction things might go with Hinchcliffe's absence. I don't want to say this is an awful story or pretend I didn't have fun with it, because it's a fine story and I had a good time, but Ultimately, it doesn't feel like it has the kind of vision that the show previously had. This is where stylistically things become less distinct in the show. I think the 4-part runtime that often works quite well for Doctor Who really starts to drag things down with this one. There just wasn't the substance to maintain that 90 to 100 minute runtime, and you can really start to see the cracks in the script across this one. In terms of why I care about what's going on here, that becomes a really hard question to actually answer, because I don't think this is a story where I did care all that much about the events. My main point of interest and entertainment came from two things. The first being the Doctor and Leela plus the intro of K9. The companion dynamic is an entertaining thing to watch on screen, at least while they actually do share screen time. The second thing is just the absurdity and wildness that is watching the Doctor be shrunk inside of himself and what comes of that. Again, substance-wise, there's just not all that much within here, which is such a shame, but there is something to be said for where this story is willing to go in terms of just coming up with a crazy idea and executing it. So it does pale in comparison to the higher stories on this list, but it had just enough going on to put it a fair bit above the previous spot. Image of the Vendall. Now, this was a story that started out with so much promise, and even if it didn't fully deliver, it does mark a point where this season feels like it's aiming for something a little bit dark and interesting. There is some good atmosphere in here. I quite like the setting. There's a fair amount of eerie stuff. Our companions are good, as is to be expected. I like the on-location sequences that were filmed as well. That's good fun. I just think it wasn't able to maintain the dark and eerie quality that it started off with, and by the time that we did get to the end, I just couldn't stay as invested. It definitely has some juice, I can tell that in making this one, people did give somewhat of a damn about putting effort into it. I just wish it had been able to retain its momentum up until the end. Although there are still moments of darkness in the final part, absolutely, I think the style and vision behind the story just doesn't have quite the same quality that it does at the start. So as said, there is quite a bit I do like about this one, hence why it makes it so high on this list. It is notably better than anything else I've discussed in this video so far, but I just know it had the potential to be even better. It's one of those good but mixed serials that makes you think about how great it could have been, even if ultimately it's still a pretty good story in its own right. As I've stated before, I think The Sunmakers is the closest this season ever gets to carving out its own distinct and unique style for the Graham Williams era of the show, in terms of balancing dark subject matter, political commentary, and captivating characters within what is just an engaging story. I mean, they really got it right with this one. Its elements of absurdity with its villains feel well integrated in here for the most part, and so that balance of a serious story with these outlandish pieces fit pretty neatly together to create something that flows well. Season 15 has two ends to this spectrum, the dark realness and the absurdly goofy. The Sunmakers takes both and melds them to create something that is allowed to have the silliness within a serial that maintains a darkness to it. It never becomes as chilling as Hinchcliffe's era or as fully outlandish as The Invisible Enemy, but it manages to make these opposing elements quite complementary to one another in a way that no other story within season 15 is really able to successfully pull off. It's actually quite the accomplishment, and for any criticisms that I may have had with this story, when compared to the previous 4 serials, it's clearly operating on a different level, and it just effectively accomplishes its goal within a nicely balanced 4-part story. If I wanted to give someone a taste for the best that this new era is able to offer stylistically, it would have to be The Sunmakers. Horror of Fang Rock is simply great Doctor Who. I've said it before and I will continue to shout it from the rooftops. I mean, at 4 parts, the pacing is really good, the atmospheric darkness is absolutely pitch perfect. There are few Who stories, even from the Hinchcliffe era, that actually lean into the depth and coldness that the show is capable of. And as I have stated, this very much is stylistically a holdover from the prior era, hence why The Sunmakers is a better example of the capabilities of the Williams era in tone, even though Horror of Fang Rock is far and away the defining story of this season, and the one I will revisit the soonest. For as much of a mixed bag as season 15 has been on the whole, I am so glad that it was able to deliver something of this caliber with the Doctor and Leela. They don't have all that many stories together, so to have just one more great one with this duo is delightful. And God, Leela is just great within here. I mean, the companion who is the most violent, who is the most physical as a fighter and the most alert, she fits so perfectly within these darker and more dangerous stories. I love seeing her interact with the supporting cast of this one. The way that she communicates with people is so entertaining. The times when she lacks patience, yeah, I mean, it's all great. I'm a huge fan of this serial, and I will continue to sing its praises because it's just great television. If you happen to be watching this video and have not seen this story, it comes incredibly highly recommended from me. It's not just the best of this season, it is one of the best of Tom Baker's run as the Doctor. And that does it for this ranking of Doctor Who Season 15. Feel free to leave yours down below if you care to do so. I may not have been the biggest fan of this season on the whole. This is the most uneven the show has felt for me in quite a while, but there's still a lot to like within here and a couple of stories that are absolutely worth your time. I'm very much looking forward to discussing the Key to Time, aka Season 16 of the show in the future, hopefully in the near future. This is the season of Classic Who I am most familiar with, and it's going to be fun to go over my thoughts on these stories and see where they differ from your thoughts. So I hope to see you all around at some point in the future for the return of these classic reviews with the Ribose operation, but if not, that is totally fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today, and with all that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.